Hi everyone, my name is Sarah Murray. I'm one of the librarians at Portland Public Library in Portland, Maine, and I'm here to read the fifth part of Protector of the Small, the First Test, written by Tamora Pierce and published by RandomHouse. We're going to pick up right where we left off with Chapter 5, Kel Backs Away. 5 weeks after her arrival at the palace, Kel decided to write a letter to her family. It was hard to get started. That morning, Peach Blossom had stepped on her foot, bruising it even through her heavy riding boot. It seemed to hurt worse as the day wore on, distracting her in her classes and at supper. Only when she had propped the foot up on a cushion placed on a stool did the throbbing ease enough to allow her to write. Dear Papa and Mama, thank you for the package with the candied fruit and the cakes. I shared with my sponsor, Neelan of Queen's Cove. He liked the cakes very much. I can't believe that 5 whole weeks have gone. I'm working hard. The teachers are strict. Master Oakbridge, the master of ceremonies, is teaching Yamani etiquette from Papa's book. I have to show everyone the submissions so much that I get dizzy. My favorite class is mathematics. I think the teacher, Master Ivor, is pleased with my work. Tell Tulane there are no banquets until Midwinter Festival, so I haven't served the king at his table yet. Pages get to practice serving Lord Wildon and his guests at supper 3 days in a row. The new pages are last on the schedule, so my turn won't come until late this year. I won't get to serve at the high table at midwinter. Only senior pages get to wait on the important people like the king. I have a horse. He is a strawberry roan gelding named Peach Blossom. He is too big for me, but I like him. He will be sold or killed if I do not keep him. He's very clever, and he plays all kinds of tricks if I do not keep an eye on him. Also, might I have some green tea from our stores? It is very expensive here, and I truly need something to drink at night as I do my classworks. I did not pack enough dresses. We are allowed to wear our own clothes to supper unless it is a feast or something. Might I have some of my other gowns and some more shifts? Could they be let down an inch? I have grown a little. Kel smiled at the last paragraph, knowing it would be a surprise for her mother. She had always preferred breeches to wear at home unless they had to don kimonos for an event at the Emperor's court. These days, however, Kel wore dresses whenever possible. She was not about to let the pages forget that there was a girl in their midst. Gowns at supper were just one way to remind them. What else could she tell her family? Kel stared at her letter, drumming her fingers. She decided to leave out that sometimes Prince Roald sat with her and Neil at supper. For one thing, it seemed like bragging. After all, the prince had made a point to sit at meals with each of the pages at least once during the week since her arrival. That he sat with her and Neil the most could simply be due to his curiosity about the Yamanis. Kel suspected that Prince Roald wanted no one to guess that he was fretting about his coming marriage to Princess Chiascami. Instead, she wrote, Does Mama still have her sketchbook from the islands? Her pictures are better than the ones in books in the palace library, and Neil wants to know what things look like. That was true enough. Neil was curious about the Yamanis and how they lived, and if the prince also looked at the sketches, so much the better. She would not mention the bad things that had happened, nor the boys' tricks, nor Peach Blossom's bad habits. That seemed too much like whining to her. Instead, she shifted her foot to a better spot on the cushion and wrote, There are sparrows who come to me for bread and the seed I get from the stables. They are practically tame and eat at my windowsill. One of them is a female with a pale spot on her head. I named her Crown. She scolds the others, and she is always first at the food, so I think of her as their queen. The sparrows get up before dawn, and it's nice to hear them chirp while I dress. There is an amazing lizard bird skeleton that is actually alive in my class on plants and animals. He likes bread too. Luckily for me, Neil said that we can ask the cooks for extra food, so I'm not forever trying to sneak rolls out of the mess hall. What else could she say? They didn't have to know that only Neil and the prince would talk to her, or that yesterday she'd been doused in a bath of muddy water when she stepped out of her room. Thanks to that, she had been very late for breakfast, causing the boys to growl as she came in. For her lateness, Wildon had given her a week of mucking out the stables, from the first spell after supper until the second. She would just finish her letter with a cheerful bit about the sparrows. Once she had finished, she turned to get her sealing wax and seal it from her desk drawer. Her bruised foot slipped from the pillow to bang on the floor. She yelled. Someone knocked on her door. Cal, open up. It's me, Neil. Drat, she muttered, and went to let him in. As he stepped in the room, he saw her lucky cats. Why are those things waving? She smiled. The legend is that a cat waving to the first emperor drew him out of the path of an enemy's arrow. The Yomanis make hundreds of them. They're supposed to bring luck. Good thing you have so many then, remarked Neil, picking one up and examining it. Cal made a face at him, very funny. She hobbled over and put the cat back where it belonged. I thought you were limping in the mess, he said. Have a seat and let me take a look. The door stays open, she warned him. Yes. Why are you holed up in here? He demanded. Come study with Rog and me. I will, she said, wincing as she lowered herself onto the bed. I just had to finish a letter home. I wanted to thank them for the cakes and things. Neil grabbed her footstool and sat by the bed. Gently he lifted her swollen foot onto his knees. And you say Peach Blossom wasn't trying to hurt you, he said. Her foot was one large bruise. He wasn't, Cal retorted. If he'd been trying, he would have broken it. I really think he's starting to Ow! There's no reason why you should have this kind of pain, muttered Neil, inspecting her toes. It figures. You aren't all ticklish. Very funny, she retorted, eyeing him nervously. What are you going to do? Fix it, he said. Foot bruises take forever to heal without help. I don't know, Cal protested, carefully drawing her foot away. The Yamani say that it's better to live with pain. You have to let it roll away like water off a stone. That way it doesn't have power over you. They sound like wonderful, cheerful people, commented Neil. Any other useful warrior stoic arguments? Cal shook her head. What would Lord Wilden say if he knew? He told his knights work through pain all the time. He does it himself. You can see it hurts him to use that arm. Wilden had shed his sling a week after the start of classes, and he used his right arm now in weapons practice and riding. Sometimes there's no healer around, or others need a healer more than you. Well, you're neither a stone, nor a Yamani, nor the stump, in case you hadn't noticed, Neil said tartly. And it's foolish to stint on healing at a palace full of mages. Don't argue anymore. His voice was firm, but his hands were gentle as he drew her leg back onto his knee. Cal thought of her Yamani teachers who were taught as children to sit unmoving in icy rains for as much as an entire day. She was being weak, letting Neil do this. She ought to refuse to help, but she couldn't. Her foot hurt too much. Neil rested her foot on his hands and bowed his head. A soft light of such deep green as to be nearly black shimmered between his palms and Cal's flesh. She felt it as a coolness that sank under her skin and sighed. The pounding in her foot began to soften until it had ceased. Her toes shrank back to their normal size as she watched. Can't believe you gave up learning to be a healer, Cal said, when Nell released her foot. I can't believe you're happier as a page. An old page at that. Neil made a face. I can name 3 who were older when they started. Please don't, Cal said hurriedly. Once Neil started to give lists of things, even a 3-person list, he would not be content until he also mentioned what books he'd learned their names from, who wrote them, and who disagreed with the writers of the original books. It was far easier not to let him get started. She said, and don't tell me that you did this all to be one of the oldest first-year pages in the realm. Neil sighed, surveying his long-fingered hands. On the great roll of knights in the Hall of Crowns, 12 Queen's Cove knights are listed. Only the Naxons have more. In the Scroll of Salute, King Jonathan I wrote that for 4 houses were the Shield of Tortle, Legan, Naxon, Hamich, and Queen's Cove. My brothers thought that knighthood was the greatest service that they could give. But it isn't the only service you can give, protested Kel. You've got brains. You've got the magical gift. Why are you bashing about here? Keeping you out of trouble, Neil said cheerfully. Try resting your weight on that. As Cal stood and walked under his gaze, he continued, As to that ill-tempered nag of yours, I have an idea. She was no scholar, but she knew when a subject was closed. He's not a nag, and I won't take another horse. I know that, said Neil, exaggeratingly patient, but perhaps we can have someone talk to him on your behalf. Come on. He led her at a brisk walk through the classroom floor to a broad stair, up 2 stories, and down a hall. The academics' room are on this floor and the one below, he explained. Some of our teachers, the ones who aren't priests, live here. You won't get to these 2 until later this year in magic class. Neil strode to a door decorated with a bronze nameplate. Numar Salmelin was engraved in the metal, Below it, in letters more recently added, was the name Virilidane Sorarsi. He rapped hard and then waited, shifting his weight from foot to foot. Why was he nervous all of a sudden? Wondered Cal. The door opened a crack, and a young woman peered out. Brown curls tumbled around a face lit by blue-green eyes. Her mouth was soft, her chin roundly stubborn. "Neil, hello," she whispered with a smile. "Did you want Numar? He's sleeping. He was up all last night and half of today on a working." "Actually, Dane, I wanted to ask a favor of you," Neil replied, keeping his own voice to a whisper. He was even more nervous than he had been a moment ago. "It's for my friend Kel here, and her horse." He likes her, Kel realized with amusement. A lot. She'd had experience with crushes. None of her own, of course, but her older sisters, Adalia and Orani, were very prone to them. Dane walked into the hall, closing the door gently behind her. "A horse? He's contrary and mean," explained Neil. "And Kel here won't give him up. Keladri of Minland, this is Virilidane Sorarsi." "Dane, Kel." Kel bowed. "You're the one Bone Dancer likes," Dane told her with a nod. "Lindhall said he'd taken to you. And Neil doesn't like your horse." Kel shrugged. She hardly knew what to say. She'd heard so many odd stories about this woman since her family had returned from the Yamani Islands. I was thinking, that you might take a look," explained Neil. "He's got a mouth like a stone. Can it be fixed? And he's mean, clear through." "Let me see him," Dane replied. "What's his name?" Her eyes focused on Cal as if she could see into the girl's heart. "Peach Blossom," Kel said. It wasn't until Dane smiled that Kel could look away from those blue-gray eyes. "Peach Blossom? Not one I know then. But I do have little to do with the noble's horses," she explained. "Let's have a look at him." Neil did the talking as they walked down to Peach Blossom's stable. He asked Dane a great many questions about people Kel did not know. She followed them, feeling out of place. When they entered the stable, all of the horses came to the front of their stalls to greet Dane. Shyly, Kel pointed her gelding out. Dane went to Peach Blossom and stood nose to nose with him, her hands cupped under the horse's chin. Peach Blossom's ears were pricked forward with interest. He was more relaxed with Dane than Kel had ever seen him. Neil made the mistake of trying to stroke him. Back went the gelding's ears, up went his head. Neil snatched away his hand. "Excuse me," he muttered. Ignoring him, Dane ran her hands over the horse, inspecting every inch. Cal watched the examination. Peach Blossom seemed to like Dane's touch. When she was finished, he rested his nose against her gown, which was now covered with horsehair. "What do you want of him?" Dane asked. "I can soften his mouth, but if you're forever dragging at the rein, it'll just get hard again. Stefan's done wonders with these scars, though Peach Blossom says they still pain him, son. I can mend them, but if you make him fight and you spur him, as some do their mounts, he'll be scarred again. I can't change his nature for you. Peach Blossom is who he is. No one has the right to take that away from him." "I wouldn't ask it," Kel replied firmly. We get along all right." Neil snorted. Kel ignored him, telling Dane, "If he didn't hurt from his scars, that might help, and softening his mouth would be a blessing. I'm not one for using the rein hard." "That's what he says. He also says that if you promise never to use spurs, he'll mind his manners a bit more." "She has to have spurs when we get to riding in armor," Neil pointed out. "This Lord Wilden makes all the 3rd and 4th years wear them." "There are spurs that don't cut the horse," said Dane quietly. "Peach Blossom was settled for those. You really want to keep him?" Kel shrugged. "It's drawing cards or death if I don't." "I'll buy him," Dane offered. "I think I have enough. I'd take him off your hands and find you a better mount." Peach Blossom turned his head away from Dane to look at Kel. She felt a pang at the thought of losing him. She admired the big gelding's independence, the way that he didn't seem to care if people liked him or not. She wished she could be more like that. Peach Blossom would be happier with someone who could talk to him, though. Dane would be good to him. Peach Blossom put 2 hooves back and then 2 more. Another step, and he could turn away from Dane to face Kel. His ears twitched forward when Kel, unbelievingly, held up her open hand as Neil winced. Peach Blossom lowered his head and softly lipped her palm. "That's that," remarked Dane. "He says you need looking after." "I never thought I'd end up agreeing with a horse," murmured Neil. Peach Blossom's ears went flat. He blew a wad of spit onto Neil's shirt. "He also says that because he will let Kel ride him doesn't mean he has to be nice to everyone," Dane remarked, her eyes twinkling. "Come to me, Peach Blossom. We've still your hurts to mend." To Kel, she added, "I'll teach him spoken commands for when you need him to go faster. You won't need spurs with those." Neil walked Jane back to her rooms. Kel returned to the pages wing alone, feeling very much in the way, and thinking of the classwork on her desk. On the way, she stopped at the mess hall. She helped herself to an apple and begged 2 rolls for her sparrows from a cook. She was near her room when she heard voices drawing her attention. They came from the hall ahead. Pages are supposed to be graceful, not clumsy. Kel knew Joran's mocking tones well. She froze. Clumsy? She also knew Merrick's voice. Something clattered and crashed. A boy yelped. Kel turned into the hall to see what was going on. 3 older pages stood over Merrick, who had fallen. Apparently he'd been carrying a heavy pitcher and cups on a tray. Now milk had splashed everywhere, and the dishes lay in pieces. "Don't just grovel there," jeered Vincent, one of Joran's friends. "Stand and mop it up." "Fetch us another pitcher of milk and fresh cups," added Joran. "How can we study if we are thirsty?" Kel clenched her fists. It was the custom that Anders had described, the one in which older pages made first years do errands to earn their right to be considered true pages. Kel had done such errands herself for the prince. Most senior pages understood that first years had little time for their work and gave them tasks that were small and quickly done. But she'd heard whispers that Joran liked the custom a bit too much and liked to add a bit of pain to his errands. Merrick stood, dripping milk, his pale face crimson with shame. I'll need cloths," he said. Joran planted his hand on the smaller boy's back and shoved. Merrick's feet slipped. He flew forward, landing on his face again. "Use what you're wearing for cloths," Joran said merrily. "They're doing well enough so far." "And shut up while you're at it," added Vincent. The third member of their trio, Sahir, caught sight of Kel. He elbowed Joran and pointed to her. "Get mopping," Joran ordered Merrick. "Every drop, mind." He turned to Kel. "What's the matter with you, probationer?" he demanded coldly. Kel clenched her fist. "This is servant's work," she said. "It has nothing to do with being a page and fetching and caring for people. It isn't what's meant by earning our way." Joran took a step forward. "This is none of your affair, unless you want what he's getting." Merrick looked at Kel and then away. Kel remained where she was, frozen with indecision. They were older, taller, and faster, with every muscle trained hard by Lord Wilden. These were student warriors that would outrank her in the Yamani Islands. There, she would owe them her obedience. In Yaman, picking on a younger warrior would be considered a waste of the time owed to your overlord, she thought numbly. If I interfere, I might give Lord Wilden an excuse to get rid of me, she realized. Joran's face went even harder. He came down the hall, fists raised. For the first time in her life, Kelladry of Mindlin ran from a fight with a bully. Reaching the safety of her room, she locked the door behind her. Even there, she thought that she could still hear the laughter that followed her escape. Somehow she managed a little classwork before the bell that rang for bed. She got into her nightdress, crawled under the covers, shivering. Over and over she saw the scene in her mind, with poor Merrick outnumbered and unable to fight back. He'd been right to be afraid, she told herself repeatedly. She'd been right to be afraid. Giving way to superior force was how their world worked. Someday she and Merrick would both show Joran and his crew how it felt to be humiliated and afraid. Someday they would fear her. So, if she thought that they would fear her, why didn't she feel better? She'd done the wise thing, hadn't she? "You could tell them," a voice whispered in her heart. "You know they tripped Merrick deliberately. No one is supposed to take the earning your way custom that far." She flinched at the thought, though. Pages were not tattletales. They dealt with problems or they suffered in silence. Everyone would despise her for breaking that unwritten law. Lord Wilden would despise her. Her brothers would shake their heads in shame. She'd be sent home. "You saw a bad thing done, and you didn't raise your hand or speak out," argued her better self. "Could you swear a knight's oath, knowing that you once let bullies get away with it? If I get into fight, won't Lord Wilden use that as an excuse to be rid of me?" Perhaps not. She'd heard Anders' stories. Pages were expected to fight, win or lose, and take the punishments doled out. Alana the lioness was in fights as a page. She got punished for them all. She took her punishment and never gave up the names of those she'd fought with. That was how things were done. Of course, none of them had been on probation. Only Kelladry of Midland was served that bowl of sour soup. "Stop feeling sorry for yourself," she scolded, trying to find a spot in her bed that wasn't hot from her thrashing around. We don't argue with customs, we obey it. Wiser people than us started such things. It's as simple as that. But what if the custom is wrong? Demanded the part of her that believed in the code of chivalry. A knight must set things right. Not a knight yet, she told herself, punching a pillow that seemed determined to smother her. I'm not even a real page. I'll worry about things like that when I am. Shouldn't I worry about them all along? If I don't worry about them as a page or a squire, why should I care about them when I'm a knight? At last, she slept. The first thing that she noticed was not a part of her unhappy night was the prickle of tiny claws on her hand. She opened her eyes and looked down. A sparrow, the female with a spot on her hand that Kel had named Crown, stood on her hand looking at her. Crown turned her head this way and that, as if trying to decide what to do with this great, lazy girl who lay abed when the sun was about to rise. Kel looked at her windows, certain she had not opened the lower set of shutters the night before. She was right, only the small upper shutters were open. Crown had flown in through those, seeing well enough in the pre-dawn glow to land safely on Kel. It seemed the bird had exhausted her supply of patience. She jumped onto Kel's chin and pecked her gently on the nose. All right, Kel croaked. At the first movement of her chin, the bird hopped back to her chest. Tell your friends I'm coming. Crown flew up and out of the open shutters, for all the world as if she had understood. Neil said that the animals around here are strange, Kel thought, tossing her blankets aside. I guess he's right. The sparrow flock, brown and tan females, black-colored males alike, sat on the sill in a line watching her. I hope you had a better night than I did, Kel told them, getting her rolls and seed. In the mess hall, Neil squinted at her as she toyed with her breakfast. You look as bad as I feel, he croaked. Where's the sunny smile? The hello, Neil. Isn't it a wonderful day to be alive in the royal palace? Pain in the bum greeting that I usually get. Kel considered shoving her porridge into his face and decided against it. I don't know, she said at last. Why don't you go look for it? Neil sat up. Ouch, it bites. What is that supposed to mean? She demanded sharply, tired of hiding the way that she felt. That I say yes and so moat to anything, smile and go along no matter what, never argue, never complain. Neil looked more awake with every word. He ran his fingers through his hair. What's gotten into you? Did someone put hot peppers in your wash water? Nothing. Kel slammed her bowl onto her tray and carried it to the servants. Neil stopped her at the mess hall door. Did anything happen last night after you left? Nothing, she said, biting off the words. Not one God's blessed thing. She left him to finish practice and went back to her room for her practice jacket. She was halfway there when Cleon stopped her. He was a third-year page, a joker, who still sported a tan from his days spent in his father's field, bringing in the harvest. Page, I need my archer's glove, he told her with a grin. Run to my room and fetch it. When Kel frowned at him, not wanting to be bothered just then, he flapped his hands. Run along now, don't take all day. You don't want punishment duty for being late. As far as she knew, Cleon wasn't one of Joran's friends. He was just being a pain. The broad grin on his face told her that much. Well, what if I refuse, she wondered, even as her feet started down the hall, carrying the rest of her with them. What could he do to me? But she didn't refuse. If I'm a coward when I think something goes too far with the custom, I might as well be one all the time, she thought bitterly, and she ran to do as she was bid. She caught up to Cleon as the pages were filing into their first practice of the day and thrust his archery glove into his face. Very good, he said, taking it. You know, we all thought that you wouldn't last this long. Kel stared at him, thinking, what an odd thing to say. Last this long today, or last this long for 5 weeks, he asked. In training, you know. He spread his arms, taking in their surroundings. Everyone had bets that you'd run home before a week was up. He shook his head, smiling. You might as well run home now while you still have the strength. Lord Weldon will never let you say. It might surprise you, Kel retorted, keeping her face Yamani smooth. Cleon smiled oddly. He never surprises anyone. He sauntered into the yard. Maybe he doesn't know Lord Wilton as well as he thinks he does, Kel thought grimly, as she followed him through the gate. I have to believe that. Chapter 6, The Lance. Later that morning, when the pages arrived at the stable, new equipment had been placed beside their normal gear. The most important item, a saddle, boasted a high, padded front and back. Extra hands had come to show the first years how to handle all of the new items, saddles, reins, double girths, and breast collars. Kel was glad to see that the man in Peach Blossom's stall was the hostler, Stefan. He was no common stable hand, yet he didn't seem to mind teaching her. Once he'd put the new saddle on her gelding and fastened every strap, he removed it and told Kel to try. Peach Blossom sighed and shifted on his feet, just as Kel did when she was tired of dress fittings. Peach Blossom says that you didn't want Dane changing him, Stefan remarked, his eyes following Kel as she positioned the saddle. She wouldn't do it, wheezed Kel. The new gear was heavy. But you didn't want her to, Stefan repeated. Kel shrugged. It seemed bad. Like, I don't know, taking his soul. Not that buckle, the one next to it, Stefan told her a minute later, pointed. Red-faced, Kel released the strap in her fingers and picked up the right one. He also said you promised not to rowel him. Kel stared at the bandy-legged hostler, not sure what he meant, and then she remembered rowel was another name for the pointed, star-shaped type of spur favored by many knights. That's right, she said, checking the girths. How will you get him to go faster? Stefan wanted to know. She gave me words to say to him, replied Kel. Stefan nodded. She's clever, that Dane. He cleared his throat and said gruffly, Didn't think you'd be one for the spur. Try to mount now. That took practice. Kel banged her leg a few times before she managed to clear the high back. I have to do this in armor? She asked Stefan, who only grinned. Kel wriggled in the saddle, testing her ability to move once she was seated. Peach Blossom waited patiently for her to settle down. About Peach Blossom, I'd like to know who treated him so badly, she added, gathering her reins. The little man chuckled. Don't fret about that, he replied. Leave it to me. The one that did it, he won't abuse another mount. You have my word. He slapped Peach Blossom on the rear, sending the gelding out of the stall. Once outside, Kel leaned down and told the horse, I think I'll stay on his good side, just in case. As usual, she was the last page to reach the long riding yard. Wilden stood just inside the gate, a row of lances set against the fence beside him. Joran stood there, too. As each page rode by, Joran passed a lance up to him. He even passed one to Neil. By the time Kel reached Joran, only one of the 12-foot-long weapons remained. Joran ignored her and mounted his horse. Take it, Wilden ordered Kel, with a sharp nod at the lance. Leaning down, she gripped the weapon and dragged it to her. It was very like a long staff in most ways. There was an indented grip cut into the wood about 18 inches from the butt, and the wood above the grip flared out to protect the bearer's hand. This weapon should never slide out of her hold. The lance was heavier than a staff, too. Kel gritted her teeth and settled the butt of the lance on the edge of her stirrup, as Lord Wilden did. The pages lined up. As Kel guided Peach Blossom into the line beside Seaver, Wilden rode to stand in front of them. Before the Immortals came, there was a clamor to cut jousting from the tournaments, he said loudly. It was said to be too risky, even with a coromantel, a wide-faced piece on the lance tip to soften the impact. It was too dangerous. So few battles are fought between mounted knights. It was said it was time to retire the lance. Tradition must change to come into step with modern times. Wilden turned his mount towards the far end of the field. There, Kel saw 5 quintains, dummies painted like warriors and set on wooden posts. In place of each quintain's left arm was a wooden shield with a target circle painted on it. In place of the right arm was a pole, weighted at the end by a sandbag. Lord Wilden braced his lance under his right arm and lowered it until it was level. Once in place, it pointed at an angle across the mare's withers, into the air on Wilden's left. My lord? Asked Merrick, raising a hand. Lord Wilden raised his eyebrow. Shouldn't it stick straight out in front of you, not across your saddle horn? The older pages chuckled. Merrick turned bright red at their amusement. Have you seen many tournaments? Lord Wilden inquired. Merrick shook his head, still blushing. None, my lord. I could do it that way, the training master said. Of course, I'd point my lance into the open air at my enemy's side. I'd risk walloping my own mount in the head. I assure you, they don't care for that. And once my lance goes past my opponent, what would happen? Merrick shook his head, speechless. Your horse rams your opponent's mount head-on, Prince Roald said quietly. Chances are you would not be able to get him out of the way in time. Aim for your opponent's chest with the lance pointed straight ahead, and by the time you've hit him, you cannot turn your horse aside. Strike his shield at the right point, and the power of your blow will either break the shield or drive him all the way out of the saddle, and you can still turn your mount away from the enemy. Do you understand now? He asked Merrick. The boy nodded. Always leave an escape route for your charger, Lord Wilden said. He turned to face the quintain. Kicking his horse into a run, he thundered down on the target. As he neared it, he stood and leaned forward. His lance tip struck the circle painted on the quintain's shield. The dummy swung in a half-turn, and Wilden thundered by. At the end of the yard, he turned his bay gelding, riding back to the line of pages. "What's the best defense for a lone knight against a giant?" he cried. "The lance," shouted the older pages. "What's the best defense against an ogre?" he demanded. "The lance," shouted all of the pages. "What's the best defense against a speedrun?" he wanted to know. "The lance," yelled his audience. Against a charging line of foot soldiers. Now the riding master joined them, carrying his own lance. "A lance!" cried everyone. If the foot soldiers aren't armed with pikes anyways. Kel heard Neil murmur. Kel blinked. Neil was right. Pikes were heavy spears, 14 or 15 feet long. Used properly, they were defeat for horsemen, who speared them rounds on the pikes before they got within striking distance of the pikemen. Wilden halted in front of him. "A knight these days relies on the lance as much as the sword," he said quietly. "To use it, you must perfect both horsemanship and the weapon. If you hit the quintain," he pointed to the swinging dummy, "anywhere but that target circle, you will get a buffet from the sandbag to make the lesson stick. And it must stick. Immortals and enemy infantry do not forgive mistakes." He dismounted and waved a fourth-year page to a line of chalk drawn near the end of the yard. "I want you new lads up on this line. Watch the older ones as they charge. Notice they change position as they approach the target. See how the lance is couched and gripped." The first years obeyed. They watched sharply as page after page took his place in the line, settled his lance, and set his horse at the quintain. The fourth-year pages hit their target almost every time, but the younger the rider, the more likely that the sandbag would spin around and thump him as he rode by. At last it was the turn of the first-year pages. Kel grew more and more nervous, wiping her sweaty palms on her sturdy practice clothes. She knew before he struck the target that Neil would miss the circle. She covered her eyes as the sandbag thudded into his back. At least he couldn't be knocked out of the new saddle and onto the ground. "We thank the gods for the blessings we have," she thought gloomily, and towed Peach Blossom over to the chalk line. Behind her, the senior pages lined up. They would ride at the quintain again once she was done. Lord Wilden strode over briskly. He resettled Kel's grip on the lance with impersonal hands, checking her saddle, and stood away at last. "The lance will slide back when you strike," he told her as he had told the other first years. "Let it. Now lower it across your chest till it points out over your mount's left shoulder. Once it's down, keep that point level." Kel struggled to raise the lance. It was quite happy to be lowered and agonizingly hard to raise. "Go," ordered Wilden. Kel leaned forward, her back and shoulder muscles protesting as she fought to keep the lance tip from sagging. "Charge," she ordered Peach Blossom. The gelding took off, his speed thrusting Kel against the back of her saddle. "Get your point up! Get it up!" cried Wilden, in a battlefield roar that cut through the thunder of Peach Blossom's hooves. "Raise your point!" Kel fought the weapon and her fear of the horse. Never had she suspected that a full gallop on Peach Blossom would feel like riding an avalanche. I should have just said go faster, she thought weakly, as the target loomed. Wrestling with the lance, she just clipped the shield's edge. The quintain spun. The sandbag crashed into her side as Peach Blossom thundered by. Kel dragged on the reins as hard as she would have the day before. Peach Blossom, already slowing, reared back in protest against the new pain in his soft mouth. The back on the jousting saddle kept her in her seat, but just barely. Peach Blossom walked backwards, doing his best to keep her from falling. Kel loosened the reins, taking the pressure off the bit. Slowly, the horse dropped until all 4 feet were planted firmly on the ground. Kel leaned forward, the weight of her lance dragging at her arm. "I'm sorry," she whispered to the gelding. "I forgot your mouth. I won't do it again." "The horse is too big for that page," someone called. "I'm surprised you let him ride that gelding, Cabal." Kel wilted. The pages had learned to ignore onlookers in the practice yards. She hadn't even noticed that an audience had gathered, or thought that anyone in the audience might care enough to comment. "The probationer picked the mount herself," Golden Lake replied Wilden coldly. "She had a choice of horses, just like the others." Humiliated, Kel braced her lance on her stirrup. Once it was upright, she could control the wretched thing, and turned Peach Blossom. A squad of warriors mounted on fine horses watched from outside the yard's fence. They wore the chainmail, blue and silver tunic, and the white desert burnous of the king's own, the crown's elite guard. Kel wished that she could just sink into the ground and prayed that her Yomani schooling kept the humiliation out of her face. These men were admired as knights, and they had seen her disgraceful try. Most were grinning. One of them, a very tall, big man with rosy cheeks and black eyes, stared at Kel. "This is the girl?" he asked, startled. It was he who had commented to Wilden. The training master grimaced. "Keldry of Mindlin. She knows she may exchange her mount for another, and has chosen not to. Have you something that we may assist you with?" The big man shook his head. "Not this time. We have reports of a lone Taurus sighted nearing one of the fishing villages upriver." Kel was trying to remember what a Tauros was when a Bazir with the squad commented dryly. "No doubt it's a strayed bull." "That's it," Kel remembered. Tauroses were creatures with bull's head and men's bodies, huge, witless monsters who preyed on women. "Stray bull or not, we'll handle it," said the big rider. "You and your lot will get the chance to help us soon enough, Cavell." He touched his fingers to his forehead in an ironic salute and rode off at the front of the squad. "If we may proceed," Wilden asked pages, "you will have plenty of chances to gawk at Raoul of Golden Lake in the future." Kel bit the inside of her cheek. Raoul of Golden Lake was the knight commander of the King's Own, one of the realm's finest warriors. Neil rode over to her. "Are you all right? You have the oddest look on your face." Kel shook her head. "I'm just embarrassed. Suppose you don't know how to make people vanish." "It's not something they teach healers," he said dryly, riding to the starting line with her. "If I could do it, I do it all the time. Don't fret, no one hits the mark on their first day." "But in front of Sir Raoul of Golden Lake," she replied in a low voice, "you fought a giant on foot and won." "Actually, he's Lord Sir Raoul of Golden Lake and Mallory's Peak. The king elevated him to the peerage in April," Neil informed her, "and I was only a 20-foot giant." "Oh, well, I don't feel half so stupid now," muttered Kel. Time to change the subject. "What was that about us helping the King's Own?" "The Stump likes us to get battle experience against immortals. If there's something close by, the King's Own takes us along." Wilden called, "You older pages practice separately. Get to it." They drifted to the other 4 quintains, leaving the first years to practice under Wilden's eye. Wilden beckoned to Quindon of Marty's Hill, indicating that he should tilt next. "Excuse me, your lordship, but am I older or younger today?" Neil asked. "One day I will tie that insolent tongue of yours a knot," replied Wilden absently as he watched Quindon settle his lance. "You may tilt with the first years." Kel saw Neil open his mouth to reply and swung Peach Blossom into Neil's brown mare. The mare skipped away as Peach Blossom half-turned, ensuring that the gelding caught just a fold of Neil's practice clothes in his teeth instead of Neil's right leg. By the time Kel had persuaded her mount to release her friend, Neil had forgotten whatever answer he was about to give to the training master. Kel rode 4 more times at the quintain. Each try was a fight with the heavy lance. Not once did she manage to keep the point high enough to strike the circle. By the 3rd run, her arms felt weak as overcooked noodles. Kel dragged as she brushed Peach Blossom, cleaned her new tack, and cut her name into her lance, and then rubbed oil into it. Only when those chores were done could she return to the castle and her waiting bath. "What's wrong?" Neil asked her, as they stood in line for lunch. "You've been quiet all day, not that you ever chatter." He peered at her so worriedly that Kel had to smile. "I didn't sleep well, that's all. I'm sorry I was grumpy." "Stop pushing, Esmond," growled someone behind her. The next minute, Kel was knocked out of line. Turning, she saw that the one who'd bumped her was Merrick. Beet red, he mumbled an apology and shoved Esmond in revenge. It gave him a reason to turn his back on Kel as she resumed her place. "He can't even look at me," she thought miserably, leaning against the wall, "and I can't look at him. Wonderful." She was leaving to collect her books and papers when Cleon stopped her once again. "Page Keldry," he announced with a broad grin. "My flower, my dove. I need more ink. Run along to the stores and fetch me some." "Leave her be, Cleon," said Neil sternly. "She's got enough to worry about without doing your errands." Cleon stared at him. The senior pages were always cautious when it came to Neil. First year or not, he was older and taller than all of them, and once he lost his temper, he didn't seem to care if he got hurt. Boys who thought nothing of pushing around someone like Kel or Merrick or the other first years tended to leave Neil alone. "I didn't ask you, Neil," Cleon retorted at last. "She has to get used to running errands sometime." Even the nobles hardly ask us to do anything for them, argued Neil hotly. They know we're kept trotting. Cal ran to do as she was told, shaking her head. Trust Neil to extend the whole matter by debating about it. She made it to their first class just in time, handing Cleon his ink as she rushed to her seat. Only when she sat down and began sorting out the mess of her own books and papers did she see how little that she'd actually finished the night before. When Master Yayan, who taught reading and writing, requested her work, she stood and admitted that she didn't have it, as tradition demanded. The Mithrin's thick brows came together in a scowl. Very well, Page Kelletry, he said. Report to us orally on the chapter you were to write about. Kel swallowed hard, fighting to keep her feelings out of her face. I did not read it, Master Yayan, she replied, staring past at him. No sense in arguing with a lump, someone in the back of the room muttered. Silence, the teacher snapped. His favorite prop was a long wooden rod that he used as a pointer. In the first week of classes, Kel had learned that the rod also indicated the teacher's mood. Now he tapped its point slowly and steadily on the floor. Bad sign, thought Kel, damp at her temples and palms. Very bad sign. Page Kelletry, have you an explanation? Custom dictated only one reply. Explanations were regarded as excuses. I am stone, Kel reminded herself. No, Master Yayan. She squeezed the words out of a tight throat. Page Kelletry, if you cannot perform a modicum of work required, you do not belong here, the teacher informed her coldly. Reconsider your commitment to your studies. Tomorrow you will summarize the next 3 chapters in the book. Sit down. Kel sat. She could hear the snickers from the other pages, but she kept her face as smooth as stone. In mathematics, she winced as she saw how creased and blotched her sheet of last night's problems were. She handed it in anyways and sat through class with shoulders hunched, waiting for a reprimand. Master Ivor liked to correct their work at his desk, as one of them solved problems on a large slate in the front of the room. Somehow he did both easily. Papers with his written comments were handed back at the end of class. He gave Kel hers with raised eyebrows and then passed the next student. She looked down and read the note that he'd scrawled on the cleanest part of the paper. I hardly believe this is yours. Redo it properly with tonight's assignment. She could have kissed him, but that she was so relieved. At least he did not want to humiliate her, even though she had disappointed him. Since mathematics was her favorite class, she hated the idea that he might think her lazy. Sir Miles did not assign written work, only reading, and didn't call on Kel for anything. The thought that he might kept her nervous of the class. She couldn't even remember what he'd assigned until one of the boys he called on talked about the material. On her way out of class, Sir Miles asked, Kelletry, might I have a word? Probably wants to know what the Yamani Emperor has for breakfast, Neil muttered out of the side of his mouth. Kel frowned at her friend and walked up to the plump teacher's desk. It took an effort of will to keep her hands flat at her side, not twisting nervously together. Is everything well? Sir Miles wanted to know. You look wan. Sir? She asked, puzzled by the word, and wondering why he'd singled her out. Tired, pale, exhausted. Are you getting enough rest? The boys aren't hounding you, are they? Kel shook her head nervously. No, sir, I'm fine. Couldn't be better. His beautifully curved eyebrows rose. And of course it would be shameful of you to say otherwise. Here, at least, Kel was on firm ground. Yes, sir. Paige must endure everything that comes. Yes, sir. Last answers that she knew. And from where did you learn this? Miles inquired mildly. From Sir Wilden, that paragon of knightly virtue. Kel frowned. Was Sir Miles being sarcastic? I learned it from my brothers, and from the Emperor's warriors at the Yamani Imperial Court, sir. The eyebrows lifted another 1/4 of an inch. Miles tilted his head to one side. He reminded Kel of the sparrow Crown who had pecked her nose that morning. Suddenly her gloom lifted a touch. She ducked her head to hide a smile. What does it take to become a Yamani warrior? Miles inquired. He seemed genuinely interested. Takes a great deal of running up and down mountains in the rain and not complaining about it, Kel said instantly, and then clapped her hand over her mouth. What if he thought that she was being impudent? But there was something about him, a sort of waiting kindness that made her want to answer him frankly. To her relief, Miles chuckled. I've heard of this odd behavior, he admitted. But you admire the Yamanis. Oh, yes, sir, she replied, nodding. They keep going through anything. Miles sighed. It is my misfortune to be dumped amid so many warrior stoics, he remarked, shaking his head. Sir? She asked, confused. That sounded like the best company in the world. Never mind, run along to Master Lindhall, and Kelladry. She turned halfway to the door. Sir, if you need a friend, if you need someone to talk to, the servants can tell you where to find me. She stared at him for a moment. The lioness's adopted father was offering her friendship? Thank you, sir, she said, and bowed deeply. Miles waved her on. Somehow, Kel got through the rest of the afternoon without further mishap. She had completed her night's work for Master Lindhall and to carve the basilisks, and could hand it in with a free conscience. In etiquette, Master Oakbridge was still using her as a secondary teacher of Yamani manners and had not assigned other work to her. She had no awkward excuses to make to him. As she changed into a dress for supper, memories of her flight from Joran and his friends, kept at bay by exercise and worry about classwork, came rushing back. Angry with herself, she picked up the practice glaive that she'd brought from home and did a series of quick exercises with it. When she finished, her arms, already tired from that morning's work with the lance, were trembling. It was time to go to the mess hall. Enough fussing, she ordered herself. Next time I'll say something is all, even if it's against tradition. I won't have another day where I go around feeling like a whipped dog because I turned my back on Merrick. At supper, Prince Rald and Neil discussed the problems that they'd been set in magic training, while Kel considered her problem with the lance. Her second oldest brother, Innes, had told her loftily that a girl's arms were not as strong as a boy's. After that morning, she had to agree. All the other first-year pages had been able to keep their lances from pointing to the ground. I'll have to train harder, decided Kel. I'll have to strengthen my arms. She fiddled with her spoon, wondering if she'd ever be able to lift that cursed lance. Then Joran's voice rang out over the room. I swear, those Shang warriors have an exercise for everything. If you wish to be a herald, Joran, apply to their college in the morning, Wilden said, raising his own voice. Until then, converse in a more seemly way. A brief hush fell. As Wilden gave the signal to rise, Neil asked her, Are you studying with us tonight? In a while, she promised. Do you know where I might find the wildcat? For once, Joran had helped her. If anyone would know how to strengthen her arms, it would be a Shang warrior who spent her life fighting men. She had to try a couple of the places that Neil and Rald suggested, but it was successful at last. Ida Bell was happy to show Kel exercises for the arm. The hardest involved lying flat on the ground, pushing the body up with both arms, lowering it partway, and then pushing it up again. Kel managed only 3 of the exercises under the wildcat's eye before her exhausted arms gave out. Ida promised her that if she kept exercising, she would do better soon. Feeling hopeful, Kel headed back to the page's wing. That's where we'll stop today. We will pick up next week with Chapter 7, Kel Takes a Stand. We're reading the first book of the Protector of the Small series, First Test, written by Tamora Pierce and published by RandomHouse. My name is Sarah Mari. I'm one of the librarians at Portland Public Library in Portland, Maine. Thank you for listening, and I hope to see you again soon. Bye.